My wife and her family threw a luxurious dinner without me on my birthday. Oh, today was your birthday. Make sure to clean up after us. I quietly picked my wallet and headed to a restaurant worthy of my special day. When they came to ask me to clean up, they found my letter. Wife's face froze and my wife's mother was left speechless. My name is Marcus Hale, and if you're looking for some soba story about a downtrodden guy who finally found his backbone, well, you're in the right place. But let me tell you something right off the bat. This isn't some Disney fairy tale where the underdog gets his happy ending through sheer determination and a catchy musical number. This is real-life Chicago style where the wind cuts through you like a knife and the people you love can be even sharper. So here I am, 38 years old as of today. Though apparently nobody got that memo, sitting at my drafting table in what used to be the mansion's library before it became my makeshift office. The irony isn't lost on me that I'm surrounded by leather-bound books that nobody in this house has ever read. Designing buildings for a family that treats me like I'm barely qualified to design a paper airplane. But hey, that's my life in a nutshell. Professional architect by day, family doormat by night. The morning light streams through those ridiculously expensive stained glass windows that I personally had restored last spring with my money, of course, casting rainbow patterns across my blueprints for the Morrison redevelopment project. It's a beautiful piece of work, if I do say so myself, and I do because nobody else around here will. 22 floors of mixed-use space that will transform an entire neighborhood. Complete with green terraces and sustainable energy systems that would make Al Gore weep with joy. But does my wife Claire give a damn? Does her mother Margaret? Does her precious sister Isabel? Let me paint you a picture of my domestic bliss. I live in the Sheridan Road mansion. And when I say live, I use the term loosely because I'm more like a well-dressed squatter who happens to pay most of the bills. There's Claire, my wife of 8 years, who somehow managed to convince me that marrying into money was a privilege, even when I'm the one providing said money. Then there's Margaret, the Queen Mother herself, who runs this house like she's Marie Antoinette, and I'm some peasant who wandered in from the fields. And finally, there's Isabel, the baby sister who's never worked a real day in her life, but somehow always needs just a small loan to keep her latest business venture afloat. The best part, they act like I should be grateful. Like I won some cosmic lottery by getting to bankroll their lifestyles while they treat me like I'm invisible. It's like being a ghost, except ghosts at least get the satisfaction of scaring people occasionally. Me, I just get to watch my bank account drain while pretending I don't notice the eye rolls when I dare to speak at dinner. Take this morning for instance. I woke up expecting, well, hoping might be more accurate, that someone might remember it's my birthday. Not asking for a parade down Michigan Avenue or anything. Just maybe a "Hey Marcus, happy birthday" would have been nice, but no. Claire rolled out of bed, checked her phone for 20 minutes while I pretended to be asleep, then vaulted into the bathroom like I didn't exist. I heard her on the phone with Isabel planning some lunch at that overpriced place on Oak Street, discussing whether they should get manicures before or after shopping. Not once did she mention that her husband was celebrating another year of putting up with this circus. Margaret wasn't any better. I passed her in the hallway and she barely looked up from her tablet where she was scrolling through real estate listings, probably looking for another property for me to help finance. "Good morning, Margaret," I said like the polite little husband I am. She grunted something that might have been a greeting or might have been indigestion. Hard to tell with her. And Isabel, well, she was still unconscious at 10 a.m., which is practically dawn for someone whose biggest responsibility is deciding which Instagram filter makes her look most authentic. The girl treats sleep like it's an Olympic sport, and she's going for the gold medal. Here I sit, sketching out plans for buildings that'll outlast all of us, while my family of in-laws treats me like I'm some kind of convenient ATM that occasionally offers unwanted opinions. The Morrison project is my baby. A complete transformation of 6 city blocks that'll bring jobs, housing, and hope to a neighborhood that's been forgotten by everyone except the drug dealers and the city planners who love to write it off as economically challenged. I've poured my heart into these designs, working late into the night while Claire watches reality TV shows about women who make my in-laws look humble. The sustainable features alone will save the residents thousands in energy costs, and the community spaces I've incorporated will give families places to gather, kids places to play safely, and seniors places to enjoy their golden years without fear. But try explaining that to Claire. Last week, when I was excited about getting approval for the green roof systems, she looked at me like I just told her I was taking up competitive toe wrestling. "That's nice, honey," she said. Then immediately launched into a story about how Isabel's friend's cousin's boyfriend might be able to get them VIP tickets to some charity gala that costs more per plate than most people make in a month. The thing is, I used to think this was temporary, that eventually they'd see how hard I work, how much I sacrifice, how I've basically funded their entire lifestyle while my own dreams got filed away under maybe someday. I thought Claire married me for more than just financial security. I thought Margaret would eventually warm up to the guy who's been keeping her lights on. I thought Isabel would grow up and realize that money doesn't magically appear just because you're pretty and know how to pout. That I thought a lot of things. Turns out thinking and reality have about as much in common as Chicago weather and common sense, which is to say not much. But today feels different somehow. Maybe it's because I'm officially closer to 40 than 30. Or maybe it's because I spent my birthday morning alone with my drafts while my wife planned her social calendar without me. Whatever it is, something's shifting inside me like tectonic plates preparing for an earthquake. That I've been documenting things lately. Expenses, conversations, the little moments that reveal who these people really are when they think nobody's watching. Call it professional habit or call it preparation, but architects don't just design buildings. We plan for contingencies, and something tells me I'm going to need a very big contingency plan. So, you want to know how my birthday evening went? Buckle up, Buttercup, because this is where things get really classy. And by classy, I mean about as elegant as a dumpster fire in a wedding dress. I pulled into our circular driveway around 7:30 after spending the day at the office pretending that designing sustainable housing for underprivileged families was enough to fill the birthday-shaped hole in my chest. The first thing I noticed was that our driveway looked like a luxury car dealership had exploded. I'm talking serious money here. A midnight blue Rolls-Royce Phantom that probably cost more than most people's houses. A pearl white Bentley that screamed, "I have more money than sense." And a Ferrari so red it looked like it was bleeding automotive arrogance all over our imported Italian stonework. Now, you might think I'd be excited. Maybe my loving family had planned a surprise party for dear old Marcus. Maybe they'd remembered it was my birthday after all and decided to throw me a celebration worthy of the guy who keeps their credit cards from getting declined at Nordstrom. Yeah, right. And maybe pigs would start flying formations over Lake Michigan while singing show tunes that I walked through our front door. The one with the hand-carved mahogany panels that I'd had restored by artisans who charged more per hour than some people make in a week. And immediately understood what was happening. The house was lit up like the 4th of July, but instead of celebrating American independence, we were apparently celebrating the independence of my money from my bank account. The crystal chandeliers that I'd had rewired last month were sparkling like diamonds, casting warm light over what looked like a spread from Architectural Digest's How to Spend Your Husband's Money issue. Champagne flutes were singing their little crystal songs as servers in crisp white uniforms. Servers I was definitely paying for, by the way, moved through the crowd like well-dressed ghosts carrying liquid gold. And the crowd, oh, this was Chicago's finest. I recognized half of them from the society pages. The kind of people who attend charity galas not because they care about charity, but because they need somewhere to show off their latest Cartier purchases. Women dripping in jewelry that could fund a small country's education budget. Men wearing watches that cost more than luxury cars. All of them laughing. That particular laugh that rich people perfect. The one that sounds like tinkling coins, but somehow manages to be completely soulless. At the center of it all stood Margaret, my dear mother-in-law, looking like she'd raided the crown jewels of 3 different monarchies. The woman was practically a walking jewelry store advertisement with diamonds hanging off her like Christmas ornaments on a very expensive, very judgmental tree. She raised her champagne flute, and knowing Margaret, it was probably the good stuff, the kind that costs more per bottle than most people spend on groceries in a month. To my darling Isabel, she announced in that voice she reserves for public speeches and private condescension. And to the launch of her latest boutique venture, may it be as successful as all her previous endeavors. Now, here's where I should mention that Isabel's previous endeavors have had about as much success as a chocolate teapot. There was the organic skincare line that folded faster than Superman on laundry day. The artisanal candle business that literally went up in smoke, and the vintage clothing boutique that vintaged itself right into bankruptcy. But hey, why let a little thing like consistent failure stop you from throwing another party funded by your sister's husband's increasingly depleted savings account? The crowd erupted in applause and cheers, and I watched my sister-in-law bask in the attention like a cat in a sunbeam. Isabel was wearing a dress that probably cost more than my car payment, looking every inch the successful entrepreneur. She definitely wasn't. The girl could sell ice to Eskimos. I'll give her that. But unfortunately, her business acumen peaked somewhere around the level of a particularly ambitious lemonade stand. That's when I made my entrance. Picture this. Me, the guy who actually pays for this circus, walking into my own house like I'm crashing someone else's party. The conversation didn't exactly stop, but it definitely did that thing where the volume drops and people start speaking in stage whispers while pretending not to stare. I stood there for a moment, taking it all in. The flowers that probably cost more than most people's rent, the catering setup that looked like it could feed a small army. The champagne fountain. Yes, A champagne fountain. Because apparently regular champagne wasn't fancy enough for Isabel's latest business disaster celebration. And then Claire spotted me, my loving wife of 8 years, the woman who promised to love me in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, though apparently she'd been banking on the richer part. She tilted her head in that way she does when she's about to say something that sounds sweet but tastes like poison. "Oh," she said, her voice carrying that particular blend of surprise and condescension that she'd perfected over our years of marriage. "Today was your birthday." Let me repeat that for emphasis. Today was your birthday. Past tense, like it was something that happened in ancient history, not something that was literally happening right now at this very moment. While she stood in our house celebrating her sister's latest money-burning expedition. The silence that followed was the kind you usually experience right before a tornado hits. You know that moment when all the birds stop singing and the air gets thick and heavy and you know something catastrophic is about to happen? Yeah, that's silence. Then Margaret, bless her black little heart, let out this chuckle. Not a laugh, mind you, but a chuckle. The kind of sound a snake might make if snakes could express amusement at the suffering of small mammals. "Well then, Marcus," she said, her voice dripping with the kind of fake sweetness that gives you diabetes just from listening to it. "Make yourself useful. Make sure to clean up after us when the night is over." And then, this is the part that really gets me, everyone laughed. The whole room erupted in laughter like Margaret had just delivered the punchline to the funniest joke in the history of comedy. These people, these guests who were drinking my champagne and eating my food in my house, thought it was absolutely hilarious that the host should be relegated to janitor duty at his own birthday celebration that nobody bothered to acknowledge. I stood there watching these people laugh at me, watching my wife smile that cold, calculating smile that I'd somehow mistaken for warmth all these years, watching my mother-in-law treat me like hired help in my own home. The funny thing about rock bottom is that it gives you a really solid foundation to build on. And that's exactly what I was about to do. Everyone laughed that night. Everyone except me. But here's the thing about the last laugh. It's usually the best one. You know what's funny about being pushed too far? It's not the dramatic explosion you see in movies where the hero throws a chair through a window and delivers some epic speech that makes everyone realize they've been terrible human beings. Nope. Real life is quieter than that. Real life is standing in your own living room surrounded by people laughing at your expense and suddenly feeling this weird sense of clarity that that's exactly what happened to me in that moment. While Margaret's words hung in the air like toxic fog and the laughter of Chicago's social elite echoed off the walls I'd personally had painted last summer, something inside me just clicked. Not snapped, clicked like a puzzle piece finally finding its proper place. Or a lock tumbling open after years of trying the wrong key that I didn't argue. Hell, I didn't even frown. You want to know what I did? I reached into my back pocket, pulled out my wallet, the leather one Claire had given me for our 5th anniversary back when she still pretended to care about things like anniversaries, and slipped it into my jacket. Then, I walked over to the antique side table where I always left my father's watch. The only thing of value he'd managed to leave me before he decided that a heart attack at 55 was preferable to dealing with life's disappointments. The watch was a 1985 Omega Seamaster. Nothing too fancy by Sheridan Road standards, but it had been his daily companion through 20 years of construction work, and it had been mine through 8 years of architectural projects and family disappointments. I fastened it around my wrist with the kind of deliberate care you reserve for important moments. The kind of moments that divide your life into before and after. The whole time, the party continued around me like I was a ghost. And honestly, that's exactly what I'd been for years. A ghost who paid the bills and fixed the plumbing and listened to endless complaints about everything from the thread count of the Egyptian cotton sheets to the temperature of the wine cellar. A ghost who had apparently become so transparent that his own birthday could be forgotten in favor of celebrating another one of Isabel's guaranteed-to-fail business ventures. Margaret was still holding court near the champagne fountain, regaling some poor couple about her latest real estate investment opportunity. Translation: another scheme for other people to fund her lifestyle while she took credit for the profits and blamed market conditions for the inevitable losses. Isabel was posing for selfies with her friends because apparently documenting your fake success is more important than actually achieving real success. And Claire was chatting with that plastic surgeon's wife about their upcoming spa weekend in Napa. Because clearly discussing grape-flavored massages takes priority over acknowledging your husband's existence, that I walked toward the front door. My footsteps surprisingly loud on the marble flooring that had cost me a small fortune and 3 arguments with the contractor. Funny how you notice details like that when you're seeing everything for what might be the last time. The hand-painted wallpaper I'd special ordered from Italy. The custom millwork that had taken craftsmen 6 weeks to install. The Persian rugs that were older than some small countries. All of it paid for by the guy who was apparently invisible to everyone enjoying it. Not one person tried to stop me. Not one person. Think about that for a minute. I'm walking out of my own house during a party that's being thrown with my money, and 60 plus people just watch me leave like I'm some random caterer heading out for a smoke break. My wife, the woman who supposedly loves me enough to have promised to spend her life with me, didn't even pause in her conversation about overpriced spa treatments. My mother-in-law, who's been living off my generosity for years, was too busy planning her next financial conquest to notice that her primary funding source was walking away. And my sister-in-law. She was too busy pretending to be a successful businesswoman to realize that her main investor was about to become unavailable for future bailouts. The night air on Michigan Avenue hit me like a revelation. You know how sometimes you don't realize you've been holding your breath until you finally exhale? That's what stepping outside felt like. The air in that mansion had been thick with entitlement and suffocating with the weight of unspoken expectations. Out here with the Chicago wind cutting through my suit jacket and the city lights twinkling like earthbound stars, I could actually breathe again. That I stood there for a moment looking back at the house through those ridiculously expensive windows. I'd had triple glazed for energy efficiency. The warm light spilling out onto the perfectly manicured lawn made the whole scene look like a Christmas card. If Christmas cards featured selfish people celebrating their own greed while ignoring the guy who made it all possible. That's when I pulled out my phone and made a call that would have shocked the hell out of the Marcus from this morning. I dialed Elena, the Michelin-starred restaurant downtown that I'd been wanting to try for months, but never could because Claire always found reasons why we needed to eat at the same boring society hangouts where she could see and be seen by the right people. Elena's, this is James. How may I help you? The voice was warm, professional, actually interested in helping rather than dismissing. Hi, I'd like to make a reservation for tonight if possible. Chef's table for one. There was a brief pause, probably because normal people don't call for same-day reservations at restaurants that book months in advance. But then James came back with something I hadn't heard in my own house in years. Enthusiasm. Let me see what I can do for you, sir. Tonight's a special evening, and we always try to accommodate guests who appreciate culinary artistry. May I have your name? Marcus Hale. Another pause. This one different. Mr. Hale, the architect, I believe you designed the building that houses our sister restaurant in River North. That's right, sir. It would be our absolute pleasure to host you tonight. We have a cancellation at the chef's table for 8:30. Would that work for you? I looked back at the mansion one more time, watching through the windows as my family continued their celebration of everything except the person who made it possible. 8:30 would be perfect. Wonderful. We'll see you then, Mr. Hale and sir. It's going to be an exceptional evening. As I walked toward my car, the sensible BMW that Claire always complained wasn't flashy enough for our social status. I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. It took me a moment to identify it because it had been so long since I'd felt it. Hope. Tonight, for the first time in longer than I could remember, someone was going to treat my birthday like it mattered. Tonight, I was going to do something just for me. Not for Claire or Margaret or Isabel or the endless parade of social obligations that had consumed my life. Tonight, Marcus Hale was going to remember what it felt like to matter. Let me tell you something about driving through downtown Chicago at night when you've just walked out on your own birthday party that nobody bothered to acknowledge. It's like seeing the city for the first time. The lights look brighter. The architecture seems more impressive. And suddenly you remember why you fell in love with this concrete jungle in the first place. Maybe it's because for the first time in years, I was driving somewhere I actually wanted to go. Instead of chauffeuring my wife to another mindless social gathering where I'd stand around making small talk about other people's money, Elena sits on the 32nd floor of a building I actually helped design back in my early days before I got married and my career became secondary to funding Claire's lifestyle. The elevator ride up gave me time to think about the irony. Here I was celebrating my birthday in a building that represented who I used to be, escaping from a house full of people who had no idea who I actually am. The moment those elevator doors opened, I knew I'd made the right choice. The restaurant's entrance was understated elegance. No gaudy gold fixtures or over-the-top crystal nonsense like the stuff Margaret insisted we needed at home. Just clean lines, warm lighting, and the kind of sophisticated atmosphere that whispers class instead of screaming wealth. Michael Russo, the restaurant director, greeted me like I was visiting royalty instead of a guy having a midlife crisis in a $1,000 suit. He was probably in his 40s with the kind of genuine smile that you don't see much in my usual social circles, the kind that reaches the eyes and actually means something. Mr. Hale, he said, extending his hand for a firm handshake that felt more sincere than any interaction I'd had all day. It's an absolute pleasure to meet you. We're honored to have you dining with us tonight, and may I be the first to wish you a very happy birthday. Those words hit me harder than they should have. Here was a complete stranger. Someone who owed me nothing. Someone who had never benefited from my bank account or my connections. And he was the first person all day to acknowledge that I was celebrating another year of life. I actually had to clear my throat before I could respond. Thank you, Michael. I appreciate that more than you know. Follow me, sir. We have something special planned for you. He led me through the main dining room, past tables of couples sharing intimate conversations and business partners sealing deals over perfectly prepared meals. The atmosphere was sophisticated without being pretentious, successful without being showy. Everything my home life wasn't. The chef's table was positioned with a perfect view of the open kitchen where I could watch culinary artists create edible masterpieces with the kind of passion and precision I used to bring to my architectural work before it became just another way to fund other people's dreams. The seat was comfortable, the lighting was perfect, and for the first time all day, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged. Chef Rodriguez will be preparing a special tasting menu for you tonight, Michael explained, paired with wine selected specifically for the occasion. We understand this is a significant birthday and we want to make sure it's memorable for all the right reasons. As if on cue, a sommelier approached with a bottle that looked older than some of the artifacts in the Art Institute. Mr. Hale, we'd like to start your evening with a 1987 Bordeaux, the same year you were born. It's been aging for 38 years, just like the birthday boy. I nearly lost it right there. These people, these complete strangers, had put more thought into my birthday in 30 minutes than my own family had in 38 years. They'd researched my birth year, selected a wine that had been waiting its entire existence for this moment, and presented it with the kind of care and attention that made me remember what it felt like to be valued. The first course arrived like a work of art. Delicate amuse-bouche that looked too beautiful to eat but tasted like heaven had opened a catering company. The flavors were complex, sophisticated, challenging, everything my palate had been craving after years of eating at the same boring country club where Claire insisted we needed to be seen. As I savored each bite, I could hear the kitchen staff working behind me with the kind of teamwork and mutual respect that I hadn't experienced in my own home in years. They called out orders with military precision, but there was joy in their voices, passion in their movements. These people loved what they did, and it showed in every perfectly plated dish that emerged from their workspace. The second course was even better. Locally sourced truffle ravioli that made me understand why people write poetry about food. The pasta was handmade, the filling was divine, and the truffle oil was applied with the kind of restraint that separates true artistry from showing off. Each bite was a revelation, a reminder that some things in life are worth savoring instead of rushing through to get to the next obligation. Between courses, I found myself checking my phone out of habit. Claire's Instagram was lit up with pictures from the party. Her radiant smile as she posed with Isabel. Margaret holding court with her society friends. The champagne fountain sparkling in the background. Not one mention of me. Not one hint that tonight had been anything more than another excuse to celebrate Isabel's latest guaranteed failure. But here's the thing. For the first time, I didn't care. Let them post their pictures and pretend their lives were perfect. I was experiencing something real, something authentic, something that didn't require pretense or performance. The third course arrived with a flourish. Wagyu beef so tender it practically melted on my tongue. Paired with a reduction that had probably taken hours to perfect. The sommelier poured a wine that complemented the meat so perfectly. It was like they'd been destined for each other since the beginning of time. How is everything, Mr. Hale? Michael appeared at my elbow with the kind of attentive service that made me feel like the most important person in the building. It's perfect, I told him, and I meant it. Absolutely perfect. We're so glad. The kitchen staff wanted me to tell you that they're honored to be cooking for the architect who designed the Morrison Complex. They drive past your buildings every day and feel proud to work in a city shaped by your vision. That's when they brought out the birthday surprise, a handwritten card signed by every cook, server, host, and dishwasher in the restaurant. Simple messages like, "Happy birthday, and thank you for making our city beautiful and hope your special day is as amazing as you are." I sat there surrounded by strangers who treated me with more kindness and respect than my own family ever had. Reading birthday wishes from people who appreciated my work and valued my contributions to their world for the first time in years, I felt like I mattered. You know what they say about the best revenge being served cold? Well, I'd been chilling mine in the freezer of my patients for about 6 months, and tonight felt like the perfect time to serve it up with a garnish of truth and a side of long overdue consequences. See, while I'd been playing the role of the invisible husband who magically makes money appear to fund everyone else's fantasies, I'd also been doing what any good architect does. I've been documenting everything. Because here's the thing about building a solid case. Whether it's for a construction project or a complete demolition of your family's house of cards, you need a foundation of facts, blueprints of evidence, and materials that can withstand any attempt at reconstruction. For months, I'd been quietly, carefully, methodically building my case. Every fraudulent real estate deal Margaret had orchestrated while using my name as collateral. Every small loan Isabel had begged for to prop up her latest business disaster, complete with forged documents claiming success where there was only failure. Every credit card Claire had opened in my name. Every joint account she drained for her shopping sprees and spa weekends. Every financial decision made without my knowledge but with my money that I'm an architect. Remember, we don't just design pretty buildings and hope they stay standing. We plan for structural integrity. We calculate load-bearing capacities and we always have detailed documentation of every beam, every wire, every foundation pour. And I'd been applying those same professional standards to my personal life without anyone realizing it. The letter had been written weeks ago, drafted and redrafted like the most important blueprint of my career. I'd used my father's old fountain pen, the one he'd carried through 20 years of construction sites and business negotiations, and my best stationery, the heavy Crane and Company paper that Claire had bought for important correspondence, but never actually used because texting was so much easier than forming complete thoughts. Tonight, before I'd walked out on my own birthday celebration, I'd placed that letter exactly where it needed to be, in the center of the dining room table, right next to the ridiculous ice sculpture of a swan that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. I positioned it so that when the party wound down and the guests finally went home to count their social media likes, someone would inevitably notice the envelope with my name written clearly across the front. The letter itself was a masterpiece of controlled rage and factual documentation. 3 pages of my finest handwriting. Each word chosen with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. No emotional outbursts. No dramatic accusations. No pleading or begging or asking for explanations. Just facts. Cold, hard, legally documented facts that painted a picture so clear that even someone as delusional as Margaret couldn't deny it. Page 1. Detailed Margaret's real estate schemes, the properties purchased with my credit rating, the loans secured against assets I didn't know I owned, the rental income that somehow never made it into our joint accounts. I had bank statements, property records, and email exchanges that she thought she'd deleted, but I'd recovered from our shared cloud storage because apparently criminal masterminds don't always understand how technology works. Page 2 was dedicated to Isabel's financial fantasies. The boutique that existed only on paper. The inventory purchases that were actually personal shopping sprees. The business loans I'd co-signed under the impression that her companies were successful when they were actually hemorrhaging money faster than a shark with hemophilia. I had invoices, bank records, and even screenshots of her deleting negative reviews from social media while posting fake success stories. Page 3 was my personal favorite, a detailed accounting of Claire's creative financing techniques. The credit cards opened in my name without my knowledge. The joint accounts drained for household expenses that turned out to be jewelry and designer handbags. The forged signatures on loan applications for home improvements that somehow improved only her wardrobe. I documented every purchase, every withdrawal, every lie that had been told to banks and credit agencies using my name and reputation. But here's the thing that made this letter truly devastating. I hadn't just documented their crimes. I'd also documented the solutions. Account numbers for the forensic accountant I'd already hired. Contact information for the fraud investigation specialist who was standing by. Reference numbers for the criminal attorney who'd reviewed every piece of evidence and confirmed that yes, what they'd been doing was not just morally bankrupt, but actually illegal. The final paragraph was my favorite part. Effective immediately. I will no longer be participating in this family's financial fiction. All joint accounts have been frozen pending investigation. All credit cards have been canceled. All loans have been called in. And all future requests for funding will be directed to your individual attorneys. I suggest you contact them soon because you're going to need them. I'd signed it with the same fountain pen my father had used to sign construction contracts. The same steady hand that had drafted building plans for half of Chicago's skyline. My signature was clear, confident, and legally binding because every word in that letter had been reviewed by lawyers who specialized in white-collar crime. The beauty of the timing was perfect. While they were upstairs celebrating Isabel's latest doomed venture with champagne that cost more per bottle than most people's car payments, the consequences of their actions were sitting patiently on the table like a time bomb disguised as correspondence. They'd finish their party, send their guests home, and then discover that their house of cards was about to become a house of consequences. I'd even included copies of all the evidence, neatly organized and labeled folders like the architectural drawings I'd spent my career perfecting. Bank statements in chronological order. Email exchanges sorted by participant. Legal documents arranged by severity of fraud. Everything they'd need to understand exactly how screwed they were. Presented with the same attention to detail, I brought to million-dollar construction projects. The most satisfying part, I'd carbon copied every relevant financial institution, law enforcement agency, and regulatory body that might be interested in their creative approach to other people's money. By the time they read my letter, half of Chicago's financial community would already be reviewing their files and preparing their own letters, the kind that arrive with official seals and require immediate legal representation. That I'd been carrying this letter around for weeks, waiting for the right moment to deploy it. Tonight, sitting at Elena's with my birth year Bordeaux and my hand-signed birthday cards from people who actually appreciated my existence, I could almost picture the scene back at the mansion, the party winding down, the guests departing, and then someone, probably Isabel, looking for her next victim to clean up her mess, discovering my little gift. The truth served cold and documented in triplicate. Sometimes the best birthday presents are the ones you give yourself. Picture this. It's nearly midnight. The champagne has lost its fizz. The ice sculpture has melted into an abstract art piece that nobody wants to look at. And the last of Chicago's social elite have finally stumbled out to their overpriced cars, probably texting their drivers to avoid any unfortunate encounters with sobriety checkpoints. The mansion that had been buzzing with fake laughter and genuine greed for the past 4 hours was now settling into that particular kind of silence that comes after a party. The kind where you can hear the lies echoing off the walls. Isabel, my dear sister-in-law, was doing what she does best, avoiding any actual work while loudly complaining about the need for someone else to do it. She was standing at the bottom of our grand staircase, the one with the hand-carved banister that I'd had restored by craftsmen who charged more per hour than some people make in a day. Still wearing her ridiculously expensive dress and looking like a princess who'd just discovered that castles require maintenance. "Marcus," she shouted, her voice carrying that particular blend of entitlement and irritation that she'd perfected over years of never hearing the word no. "Where are you? Come clean this mess." Her heels clicked across the Persian carpet with the rhythm of impatience. Each step a tiny percussion note and a symphony of her self-importance. She was probably already mentally composing tomorrow's Instagram post about her successful party, complete with hashtags about entrepreneurship and empowerment and whatever other buzzwords she used to disguise the fact that her business acumen peaked somewhere around a lemonade stand. But here's where things get interesting. As Isabel clicked her way through the debris of her celebration, abandoned champagne flutes, crumpled napkins, and the general detritus that comes from entertaining people who confuse expensive with valuable, she made it to the dining room where the real entertainment was waiting. There, in the center of our mahogany dining table that had been in Claire's family for 3 generations, and probably witnessed more financial crimes than a Swiss bank, sat my letter. Positioned exactly where I'd left it. Right next to the puddle that used to be a swan eye sculpture. The envelope practically glowing under the chandelier lights like a beacon of truth in a sea of the envelope was cream-colored Crane and Company stationery. The expensive stuff that Claire had bought for important correspondence, but never used because forming complete thoughts was apparently too much effort. My name was written across the front in my father's fountain pen. The same careful handwriting that had signed architectural contracts and building permits and apparently farewell letters to families who mistake kindness for weakness. Isabel stopped dead in her tracks. You know that moment in horror movies when the music stops and everything goes quiet right before something terrible happens? That was this moment. Except instead of a masked killer jumping out of a closet, it was the much more terrifying prospect of actual consequences for years of financial fraud. "Mother," she shrieked, her voice carrying the kind of panic that usually accompanies natural disasters or tax audits. "Mother, get down here." Margaret descended the stairs like a queen approaching her throne, except this particular queen was about to discover that her kingdom was built on quicksand, and the tide was coming in. She was still wearing her diamonds because apparently taking off jewelry before bed was for peasants and had that imperious expression she wore whenever she was about to deliver one of her lectures about proper behavior or fiscal responsibility, which was rich coming from someone whose idea of financial planning involved spending other people's money. "What is it now?" Isabel, Margaret demanded, irritation dripping from her voice like venom from a particularly well-dressed snake. Some of us need our beauty sleep, unlike certain people who think they can survive on champagne and social media validation. But when Isabel pointed at the table with a trembling finger that was still adorned with rings I'd probably helped finance, Margaret's expression shifted from irritation to something approaching actual concern. Because there, sitting innocently among the party debris, was evidence that somebody in this house had been paying attention to more than just the social calendar. Margaret approached the letter like it might explode, which in a way it absolutely was going to. She picked up the envelope with the kind of careful handling usually reserved for antique china or unstable explosives, turning it over in her hands like she could divine its contents through the expensive paper. "What is this?" she whispered. And for the first time in the 8 years I'd known her, Margaret sounded uncertain. Not commanding, not condescending, not dismissive, just uncertain, like a woman who was beginning to realize that the foundation of her comfortable life might not be as solid as she'd assumed. That's when Claire made her entrance. Drawn by the sound of her mother's uncharacteristic vulnerability, she swept into the dining room, still wearing her party dress, her makeup still perfect despite hours of air kissing and fake laughing with Chicago's most accomplished social climbers. But when she saw Margaret holding my letter with the kind of reverence usually reserved for court summons or cancer diagnosis, her confident smile started to falter around the edges. "What's wrong?" Claire asked, and even she could hear the nervousness in her own voice. Because if Margaret, who could negotiate real estate deals with the ruthlessness of a corporate raider and the morals of a loan shark, looked worried, then something was seriously wrong with their carefully constructed world. That Margaret's hands shook slightly as she opened the envelope. The sound of tearing paper unnaturally loud in the suddenly quiet room. She unfolded my letter with the slow, deliberate movements of someone who knows they're about to read their own obituary and began reading the words I'd crafted with all the precision and attention to detail that had made me one of Chicago's most respected architects that I wish I could have been there to see her face. As she processed the first paragraph, the way her eyes would have widened as she realized that I hadn't just been the convenient ATM she'd thought I was, but actually a very observant architect who'd been documenting every crooked board in their house of financial cards. "What is this?" she whispered again. But this time, it wasn't a question. It was the sound of someone watching their entire world crumble in real time, like a controlled demolition, where you can see each floor pancaking into the one below it until nothing's left but dust and regret. Claire snatched the letter from her mother's hands, her eyes scanning the carefully written words that detailed every fraudulent transaction, every forged document, every lie they'd built their lifestyle on. And as she read, I could imagine her perfect composure finally cracking like expensive makeup in the heat. The house of cards was falling. And gravity is you know what's beautiful about gravity? It doesn't discriminate. It doesn't care if you're wearing designer clothes or driving a luxury car or living in a mansion on Sheridan Road. When the foundation crumbles, everything falls at exactly the same speed. And there's absolutely nothing you can do to stop it except watch and pray you land somewhere soft. By morning. And I'm talking about that brutal Chicago morning when the sun comes up like an unforgiving spotlight on last night's mistakes. The consequences of my little letter were spreading through the financial community faster than gossip at a country club brunch. Because here's the thing about white-collar crime in a city like Chicago. Everybody knows everybody. And when one domino falls, the rest follow with the precision of a Swiss watch and the subtlety of a demolition crew. Margaret's brokerage contracts were the first to go. I'd thoughtfully included her license number in my documentation, along with copies of the falsified documents she'd used to secure deals that violated more regulations than a speakeasy during Prohibition. The Illinois Department of Financial and Professional Regulation doesn't mess around when it comes to real estate fraud, especially when the evidence is presented with the kind of meticulous organization that makes prosecutors weep with joy. Her phone started ringing at 6 a.m., not with congratulations on last night's party, but with cancellation notices that sounded like death nails for her carefully constructed empire. The Henderson account, worth $2 million in potential commissions, terminated effective immediately. The North Shore development deal that she'd been bragging about for months, canceled faster than a Netflix subscription after a price hike. Even the small-time investors who'd trusted her with their retirement funds were pulling out like passengers abandoning a sinking cruise ship. But Margaret's professional destruction was just the opening act. The real show was happening in Isabel's digital kingdom, where her carefully curated online persona was collapsing like a house made of Instagram filters and wishful thinking. See, I'd included screenshots of her real financial records in my letter. Not the fantasy numbers she posted on social media, but the actual bank statements that showed her boutique losing money faster than a slot machine with a gambling addiction. And when those numbers got leaked to a few key influencers who specialized in exposing fake entrepreneurs, well, let's just say the internet has about as much mercy as a pack of wolves discovering a wounded deer. Her follower count, which she'd been artificially inflating with bots and fake engagement, started dropping like the temperature during a Chicago blizzard. The comments on her posts went from goals and queen to fraud alert, and this accompanied by screenshots of her real financial disasters. The lifestyle bloggers who'd been featuring her success story were now publishing retractions and apologies, distancing themselves from her like she had a contagious case of bankruptcy. The really beautiful part was watching her brand partnerships evaporate in real time. The jewelry company that had been paying her to pose with their products. They canceled her contract and demanded their merchandise back, the fashion brand that had been featuring her in their campaigns. They scrubbed her from their website so thoroughly it was like she'd never existed. Even the local coffee shop that had been giving her free lattes in exchange for Instagram mentions stopped returning her calls. But Claire was experiencing her own special kind of financial apocalypse. Because while she'd been living it up on credit cards opened in my name, I'd been building a paper trail that would make the FBI's evidence room look disorganized. Her credit cards started getting declined at the most embarrassing possible moments. Picture this. She's at Nordstrom trying to buy a purse that costs more than most people's mortgage payments. And the sales associate has to take those humiliating scissors to her platinum card right there in front of other customers. The joint accounts she'd been raiding for her shopping sprees were frozen tighter than Lake Michigan in January, with federal investigators reviewing every transaction like archaeologists examining ancient artifacts. The country club where she'd been peacocking around for years. They politely suggested she might want to consider alternative dining arrangements until her temporary financial situation was resolved. Translation: they didn't want to be associated with someone whose husband had filed fraud charges and was cooperating with federal investigators. But here's where it gets really good. Their mansion, that beautiful sprawling monument to other people's money that had been the center of their social universe, was suddenly looking a lot less permanent. Because when you've been using property as collateral for loans you can't repay, and when those loans were secured through fraudulent means, the banks tend to get cranky about things like ownership and legal possession. The foreclosure notice arrived by certified mail on a Tuesday, delivered by a postal worker who probably had no idea he was carrying the death certificate for their entire lifestyle. Margaret signed for it with hands that shook like autumn leaves because even she understood what those official seals and legal language meant. Game over. Pack your bags and maybe start looking into rental properties in neighborhoods that don't require trust funds for admission. The really delicious irony was that their mansion, the one I'd been maintaining and improving with my money for years, was about to be sold to cover debts that they'd accumulated while treating me like invisible furniture. All those renovations I'd funded, all those repairs I'd arranged, all those improvements I'd made were about to benefit some lucky buyer who'd get the place for a fraction of what it was worth. The reporters showed up next because financial scandals involving Chicago's social elite are like catnip for investigative journalists. They camped outside the mansion with cameras and microphones, asking pointed questions about property fraud and embezzlement that Margaret, Isabel, and Claire were spectacularly unprepared to answer. The same driveway that had been filled with luxury cars just days earlier was now crowded with news vans and process servers. Their neighbors, the same social climbers who'd been kissing their asses at parties for years, suddenly developed selective amnesia about their friendships. Phone calls went unreturned, lunch invitations disappeared, and social media posts that had once featured group photos now showed mysterious editing where familiar faces used to be. The country club gossip network, which had once carried stories about their latest acquisitions and social triumphs, was now buzzing with whispered conversations about federal investigations and criminal charges. The same people who'd been laughing at my expense just days earlier were now avoiding them like they had a communicable case of financial ruin. And through it all, my phone stayed mercifully silent. No desperate calls begging for help. No tearful voicemails promising to change. No angry demands for explanations. Because apparently, when you've spent years treating someone like they don't exist, it doesn't occur to you to reach out when you need them most. The house of cards hadn't just fallen. It had been professionally demolished with permits. You know what's funny about freedom? You don't realize how much you've been carrying until you finally set it down. Walking into my architectural firm that first morning after the nuclear detonation of my marriage felt like stepping into sunlight after years in a cave. My shoulders were straighter, my head was clearer, and for the first time in ages, I was excited about the work that had made me fall in love with architecture in the first place. My office on the 14th floor of the Morrison building. Yeah, one of my own designs, which felt appropriately symbolic, had been my sanctuary during the darkest years of my marriage. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago River. Drafting tables positioned to catch the morning light and walls lined with awards and recognition that my family had never bothered to acknowledge. This was where Marcus Hale, the architect, lived, separate from Marcus Hale, the invisible husband and convenient ATM. The first thing I did was call my assistant Sarah and tell her to clear my schedule for new client meetings. Not because I was falling apart. Quite the opposite. I was finally ready to rebuild. And this time, I was doing it right. Within a week, my phone was ringing off the hook. Turns out, when you're not constantly distracted by financial fraud and family drama, you can actually focus on creating buildings that make people's lives better. The Morrison redevelopment project that I've been sketching while my family ignored my birthday, it got fast-tracked for approval after the city planning committee saw my presentation. But that was just the beginning. A developer in New York called about designing a sustainable housing complex in Brooklyn. An environmental group in Tokyo wanted me to consult on a zero-emissions office building. A non-profit in London needed someone to design affordable housing that didn't look like a concrete prison. Projects that mattered. Clients who valued innovation over intimidation. Work that would outlast the people who created it. For the first time in years, I was working because I loved it, not because I needed to fund someone else's fantasy lifestyle. I stayed late, not because I was avoiding going home, but because I was genuinely excited about the plans I was developing. I took meetings on weekends, not because I was escaping family obligations, but because I was collaborating with people who shared my passion for creating spaces that served communities instead of just ego. The money was better, too. Which was ironic since I was no longer supporting 3 additional adults with expensive tastes and flexible relationships with financial reality. Clients were willing to pay premium rates for an architect who brought both technical expertise and genuine enthusiasm to their projects. My reputation, which had been solid but constrained by my personal distractions, was suddenly soaring like a building reaching for the sky. But here's the thing that really changed everything. I started volunteering at the Riverside Foster Center on the South Side. Not because some society wife told me it would look good for our social standing. Not because it was a tax write-off, but because I genuinely wanted to do something that mattered beyond profit margins and property values. The center was housed in a building that had seen better days. Probably around the time the Cubs last won the World Series, which tells you everything you need to know about its condition. Cracked foundations, outdated electrical systems, windows that let in more cold air than light, and a heating system that worked about as reliably as Chicago politicians keeping their promises. But the kids, man, these kids were something else. They'd been dealt hands that would make professional poker players fold immediately. But they kept playing with the kind of determination that would shame most adults I knew. Kids who'd been bounced between foster homes like pinballs in a machine. Who'd learned not to get too attached to anything because everything was temporary, who developed survival skills that most of us never need, but took for granted. The first time I walked into their common room, a space that was trying to be cheerful, but mostly succeeding at being depressing, I saw potential that nobody else was noticing. Not just potential in the building, but potential in the kids who were trying to do homework at wobbly tables under fluorescent lights that flickered like strobe lights at a very sad disco. "Are you another social worker?" asked a girl who couldn't have been more than 12, but had eyes that looked like they'd seen 40 years of disappointment. "Nope," I told her. "I'm an architect. I design buildings, and I think this place could use some serious redesigning." That's how I met Destiny, who became my unofficial consultant on what kids actually needed in a living space. She had opinions about everything. Natural light requirements, study space configurations, the optimal acoustics for both socializing and quiet time. She was basically a 12-year-old architectural critic with better insights than most of my professional peers. Over the following weeks, I started spending my evenings at the center. Not just volunteering, but actually listening to what the kids and staff needed. Not what bureaucrats thought they needed. Not what looked good on grand applications, but what would actually improve their daily lives. I began sketching plans for a complete renovation. Spaces that would feel like home instead of an institution. Common areas designed for both community and privacy. Study rooms with proper lighting and sound dampening. A kitchen where kids could learn to cook real food instead of just heating up processed garbage. Outdoor spaces where they could grow gardens and play safely. The more time I spent there, the more I realized these kids understood something that my former family never had. The difference between having things and having value. They appreciated every small improvement, celebrated every minor victory, and supported each other through setbacks that would crush most adults. When I showed them my preliminary designs for the new facility, their reactions were worth more than any architectural award I'd ever received. Their eyes lit up with the kind of hope that money can't buy and entitlement can't fake. They asked questions about construction timelines and structural engineering like they were personally invested in every beam and wire. "Will it really look like this?" Destiny asked, studying my renderings with the intensity of a Supreme Court justice reviewing constitutional law. "Better," I promised her. "Because you're going to help me design it." That night, I worked until 3 a.m. refining the plans. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to. Because for the first time in years, I was building something for people who would actually appreciate it. People who understood that shelter isn't just about walls and roofs, but about creating spaces where dreams can grow and futures can be built. That I was finally remembering why I became an architect in the first place. To create spaces that make people's lives better. In my life, it was definitely getting better. Let me paint you a picture of irony so thick you could cut it with a butter knife and serve it at a country club brunch. Remember that grand mansion on Sheridan Road where I used to be treated like expensive furniture that occasionally offered unwanted opinions? Well, that architectural masterpiece, the one I'd maintained and improved with my own money for years, was now someone else's problem, and my former family was experiencing what you might generously call a lifestyle adjustment. Their new accommodations were a 2-bedroom apartment in Rogers Park, which is a perfectly respectable neighborhood if you're not accustomed to living in a house that could double as a small hotel. The apartment building was one of those 1970s constructions that screamed functional but not fancy, with thin walls, questionable plumbing, and the kind of beige carpeting that had seen more drama than a soap opera. But retained about as much dignity. Margaret, the former queen of Chicago real estate fraud, was now discovering what it felt like to be on the receiving end of housing market reality. Her bedroom, and I use that term loosely since it was barely large enough for a queen bed and a dresser from IKEA, had become a monument to fallen grandeur. Designer clothes that used to hang in a walk-in closet the size of most people's living rooms were now crammed into a particle board wardrobe that creaked every time she opened it. The woman who used to hold court in restaurants where the wine list cost more than most people's monthly rent was now sitting at a card table she bought at a garage sale staring at a phone that had become as silent as a tomb. Her contact list, which used to read like a who's who of Chicago society, was now about as useful as a chocolate teapot. Amazing how quickly people forget your number when the FBI starts asking questions about your business practices. She'd been wearing the same thrift store outfit for 3 days. A polyester blouse that probably cost less than one of her old silk scarves and slacks that had seen better decades. Her jewelry, what little remained after the asset seizures, consisted of a wedding ring from her deceased husband and a watch that kept time about as accurately as a sundial in a basement. The diamonds that used to hang off her like Christmas ornaments on a very expensive tree had been sold to pay legal fees that kept growing faster than weeds in an abandoned lot. The really beautiful part was watching her try to maintain her dignity while learning to shop at discount grocery stores. Picture this. A woman who used to have her groceries delivered by personal shoppers, now standing in the cereal aisle at Aldi, trying to figure out why she needed a quarter to use a shopping cart. She'd attempted to negotiate with the checkout clerk about the bag fees, apparently thinking her decades of real estate manipulation had prepared her for retail transactions. Spoiler alert, it hadn't. Meanwhile, Isabel was experiencing her own special version of reality therapy at a coffee shop called Been There, Done That, a name that was probably meant to be clever, but mostly succeeded at being prophetic. My former sister-in-law, who used to post inspirational quotes about entrepreneurship while spending other people's money, was now wearing a brown apron and learning that customer service is significantly harder when the customers aren't paying you to pose with their products. Her Instagram account, which used to showcase a lifestyle that was 1 part aspiration and 3 parts fiction, had become a graveyard of deleted posts and bitter comments from former followers who felt personally betrayed by her financial fantasies. The few hundred subscribers she had left were mostly there for the same reason people slowed down to look at car accidents. Morbid curiosity about how far someone can fall when gravity finally catches up with them. The job itself was a masterclass in humiliation for someone who'd spent years pretending that influencer was a legitimate career path. She had to wake up at 5 a.m., which for Isabel was basically the middle of the night, and spend 8 hours brewing coffee for people who were actually contributing something useful to society. Her co-workers were mostly college students who worked harder in one shift than she'd worked in her entire adult life. And they had exactly zero patience for her complaints about how this isn't what I'm used to. The really delicious irony was watching her try to apply her networking skills to coffee shop customers. She'd attempt to turn every transaction into a business opportunity, pitching her non-existent expertise to commuters who just wanted caffeine and a receipt. Have you ever considered diversifying your investment portfolio? She'd ask someone ordering a latte, apparently not understanding that most people don't discuss their financial planning with baristas who can't figure out how to work the espresso machine. And then there was Claire, my beloved ex-wife, who was discovering that the job market has surprisingly little demand for women whose primary qualifications include looked good at charity galas and married well. Her resume, such as it was, read like a catalog of expensive hobbies disguised as professional experience. Volunteer coordinator for the Symphony Gala, board member of the Garden Club, committee chair for various fundraising events, all unpaid positions that sounded impressive at cocktail parties, but meant absolutely nothing to actual employers. The stack of rejection letters on her side of their shared dining table, a wobbly thing she'd bought at a thrift store that would have made our old housekeeper laugh, was growing taller than the Sears Tower. Entry-level positions at marketing firms, administrative assistant roles at nonprofits, even retail jobs at department stores where she used to shop. Everybody was passing on Claire Hale like she was expired milk. The interviews she did manage to get were exercises in mutual bewilderment. Potential employers would ask about her experience with spreadsheets, and she'd talk about organizing seating charts for dinner parties. They'd inquire about her customer service background, and she'd mention the time she returned a dress that didn't fit properly. They'd want to know about her problem-solving skills, and she'd describe resolving conflicts between competing social climbers at fundraising events. But here's the part that really got to me. Every month, like clockwork, they'd receive an envelope from me. Plain white business envelope, no return address containing a check for exactly half their rent. Not because I felt guilty. Guilt was a luxury I'd given up along with subsidizing their lifestyles. Not because I still loved them. Love had died somewhere between the financial fraud and the birthday humiliation. I sent those checks out of habit. The same way you might leave food out for a stray cat that you don't particularly like but don't want to see starve. Each envelope also contained the letters they kept sending me. Unopened. Returned to cinder like unwanted mail. Sometimes the best revenge is just letting people experience the natural consequences of their choices with a front row seat to watch gravity do its work. 1 year later, I was sitting in the same chair where this whole story started. My drafting table in what used to be the mansion's library, but was now the bright airy design studio of the newly opened Riverside Community Center. Yeah, that's right. I bought the building that used to house the foster center, gutted it completely, and rebuilt it into something that would make those kids feel like they mattered. Because here's the thing about second chances. Sometimes you have to build them yourself. The morning light was streaming through windows that actually let in light instead of just existing for show, illuminating architectural plans for my next project, a sustainable housing development in Detroit where families could own homes instead of just dreaming about them. But today wasn't about work. Even though work had become something I actually enjoyed again instead of just endured. Today was my 39th birthday, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I was actually looking forward to celebrating it. The first hint that this birthday would be different came at exactly 7 a.m. when I heard the sound of hushed whispers and poorly suppressed giggles coming from the main activity room. Now, if you've ever tried to organize a surprise for someone while working with a dozen kids aged 8 to 17, you know that subtle isn't exactly their strong suit. It's like trying to hide a marching band in a library. Technically possible, but you're going to hear the tubas. I pretended to be absorbed in my blueprints while the sounds of what was clearly a covert operation echoed through the center. Chairs being moved, whispered arguments about color coordination, and at least 3 instances of someone hissing, "Shut up. He'll hear us." Loud enough to wake the dead. These kids had many talents, but stealth wasn't one of them. Destiny appeared in my doorway around 8:30, trying to look casual, but practically vibrating with excitement. She'd grown about 6 in the past year and had developed the kind of confidence that comes from having adults actually listen to your opinions instead of just patronizing you. "Mr. Hale," she said, attempting to sound nonchalant and failing spectacularly. "We need you to come look at something in the activity room. There's a problem with the lighting fixture." I looked up from my plans, fighting back a smile. "The lighting fixture that we just installed last month? The one that cost more than my first car?" "Yeah, that one. It's making weird noises." "Weird noises. Like birthday song noises." The kid had many strengths, but lying wasn't one of them. I stood up, pretending to be concerned about our potentially musical lighting situation. "Well, we'd better go investigate this serious electrical issue." Walking toward the activity room, I could hear more whispered conferences and what sounded like someone practicing the opening notes of Happy Birthday on what I suspected was a very off-key harmonica. The center had become home to about 15 kids over the past year, ranging from little Marcus, yeah, they'd named him after me, which still made me get a little choked up, to Rebecca, who was 17 and planning to study engineering in college next year with the scholarship we'd helped her apply for. Destiny pushed open the door to the activity room, and I was hit with a wall of sound that was probably the most beautiful cacophony I'd ever heard. Surprise! "Happy birthday, Mr. Hale." The room had been transformed into something that looked like a birthday party had exploded in the best possible way. Handmade decorations covered every surface. Construction paper streamers and colors that definitely hadn't been designed by any professional decorator. Hand-drawn posters that said things like "Happy Birthday to the best architect ever" and "Mr. Hale is awesome and old." The kids had clearly rated every art supply in the building and used them with the kind of enthusiastic disregard for conventional aesthetics that only children can pull off. But the centerpiece was a cake that looked like it had been decorated by a committee of sugar-high 8-year-olds armed with every tube of frosting they could find. It was lopsided, covered in enough sprinkles to fund a small country's gross domestic product, and had "Happy 39th Birthday, Marcus," written in frosting that was 3 different colors and approximately 4 different fonts. It was absolutely hideous and completely perfect. "We made it ourselves," shouted Tommy, a 10-year-old who took pride in everything he did, whether it was homework or cake decorating. Rebecca helped with the oven parts because we're not allowed to use the oven without supervision, but we did all the decorating. "I can tell," I said, and I meant it as the highest compliment. "It's the most beautiful cake I've ever seen." And then they presented me with cards. Not store-bought cards with generic messages, but handmade cards that they'd clearly spent hours on. Cards with drawings of buildings that were supposed to be my designs, but looked more like abstract art created by very optimistic aliens. Cards with messages like, "Thank you for giving us a real home." And, "You're the best grown-up we know." And, "Happy birthday to our favorite old person." But it was little Marcus' card that really got me. He was 8 years old and had been bounced between foster homes since he was 3, never staying anywhere long enough to feel like he belonged. His card was a drawing of stick figures standing in front of a building that was definitely supposed to be the center and written in crayon with the careful penmanship of someone still learning how letters work. Thank you for making us a family. That's when I lost it. Not the dignified single tear rolling down the cheek kind of losing it that you see in movies, but the full-blown ugly crying can't catch your breath kind of breakdown that happens when someone sucker punches you right in the feelings. These kids who'd been abandoned, neglected, shuffled through a system that treated them like paperwork instead of people, were calling me family. Me, the guy who'd spent years being invisible to the people who were supposed to love him most, was being claimed by kids who had every reason to not trust adults, but chose to trust me anyway. Are you okay, Mr. Hale? Destiny asked, looking concerned. Did we make you sad? No. I managed to say through the tears that wouldn't stop coming. You made me happy, happier than I've been in 39 years, and that's when they really surprised me. Every single one of them, from 8-year-old Marcus to 17-year-old Rebecca, surrounded me in what can only be described as the world's best group hug. Not because they felt sorry for me, not because they thought they should, but because they wanted to. Because in their eyes, I wasn't just the guy who'd built them a better place to live. I was family that we spent the rest of the day eating terrible, wonderful cake and playing games that had no rules and making enough noise to disturb every neighbor in a 3-block radius. And when evening came, I didn't go home to an empty apartment to nurse my loneliness with expensive whiskey and architectural journals. That I stayed right where I was, surrounded by the family I'd built instead of the one I'd been born into. The family that chose me just as much as I'd chosen them. Later that night, my phone buzzed with another call from Claire. I looked at it for a moment, then turned it face down on the table next to my stack of birthday cards from kids who actually knew my worth, that I already had everything I needed. This was the birthday I'd always deserved, celebrated with the family I'd always wanted. And for the first time in 39 years, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged.